All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I hope that they can see me. I can never tell with Zoom, so I'm going to switch it to gallery view. Look
Sure.
what I have here. This is a big book, right? It's called Hellenistic Astrology, and today the author of this book is with me. This book is very heavy, right? And it's not just because it's big, because most of the books these days are very light, even if they're big, because they don't have a lot inside them.
Yeah, that's true.
But this book it's just literally, I've read about the first 3 chapters so far, and there's more fact. It's just packed with facts and important information, like sentence after sentence after sentence. So it's really a heavy book. Everybody who's interested in the history of astrology should really like this. And then in the later sections, you also talk about the actual practice of the ancient forms, right? The classical.
Yeah, like the first 5 or 6 chapters are on the history and philosophy of ancient astrology, and then we go into basic techniques, and then we go into intermediate and advanced techniques.
Great. So first thing I want to know is, there's this word here, Hellenistic, and every time I hear it, I think of Helen of Troy. So
Right.
What does it actually mean?
Sure. I mean, Hellene is the term that Greeks actually use to mean Greek. So it's tricky because we don't have a really good term, like most traditions of astrology. We don't have a really good concise term for referring to it. So we borrowed a term from academic historians who refer to the Hellenistic period, which is a period of time that starts with the conquests of Alexander the Great, when him and a bunch of Greek-speaking, basically Europeans, conquered the Middle East and parts of Africa all the way over to the western coast of India. And that inaugurated the Hellenistic period, which is a period in which Greek culture was infused throughout and sort of exported throughout different parts of the ancient world, and then was merged and mixed with the indigenous cultures of the places that Alexander conquered to create a new synthesis. And that lasted for about 3 centuries, all the way until about the 1st century BCE, when you have the death of Cleopatra and Rome taking over the Mediterranean. That's typically said to be the end of the Hellenistic era proper. So Hellenistic astrology is the type of astrology that originated around that time period, around the 2nd century BCE.
So it has nothing to do with Helen of Troy.
No. So unfortunately, not with Helen of Troy.
Hellene is just the Greek word for this is us. We're Greeks. Hellene.
Yeah, essentially.
And then it's not literally like Greek astrology, but it's the result of Greek astrology mixing with other cultures.
Yeah, some people call it Greek astrology. There's a book called Greek Horoscopes, for example, and most of the texts from this tradition were written in Greek from about 2,000 years ago, but that's because Greek became the sort of like common language around the Mediterranean for scientific and philosophical works. And one of the issues, and the reason I don't call it Greek astrology, I prefer to call it Hellenistic astrology, is because just because the text was written in Greek, it doesn't necessarily mean that the author was ethnically Greek.
Right.
They could have been an Egyptian, priest. They could have been an immigrant from Mesopotamia who came over to live in Alexandria. We don't really know, but Greek was the common language. So it's easier to say Hellenistic to refer to almost like a time period, which there's this implied notion of cultural synthesis and mixing during that time period. And so that's why I use that term rather than just calling it Greek astrology. I could have called it Greco-Roman astrology is another good term that I could have used, but I decided to go with Hellenistic because it's a bit more common at this point.
So you've coined the term Hellenistic astrology, or is it widely used?
No, it's a term that's been used by some academics for a few decades now, and then more recently in the astrological community since the 1990s, that became especially the term that was used to refer to that tradition of astrology. So it had so much momentum. While I could have tried to reframe it as Greco-Roman astrology or something like that, I decided just to stick with referring to it as Hellenistic astrology because the type of astrology that it represents, even though it was practiced for several centuries after the Hellenistic era proper, so after the 1st century BCE, it still continued to contain and convey many of the same scientific and philosophical and religious and cultural concepts stayed embedded in that system from the 1st century BCE for quite a while. So it's still sort of an appropriate term to call it Hellenistic astrology.
So even though it was practiced after the Hellenistic period, since it developed during the Hellenistic period, we'll still call it Hellenistic astrology.
Yeah, that's basically it. And so what we're using the term Hellenistic to refer to when we say Hellenistic astrology is a tradition of astrology that was practiced in the Mediterranean region roughly from about the 1st century BCE until about the 7th century CE. So
Ah,
that roughly coincides with the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, basically.
okay. Now, you said that Alexander took his empire up to the borders of India, right?
Yeah, Alexander made it as far as India before he ran into a lot of problems, attempting to basically conquer India. And his army, there was a mutiny basically, and he was forced to turn back and go back to Mesopotamia, where he promptly died at a very young age. But
Hmm.
they made it all the way to India.
Hmm. Now, have you heard of the book Yavana Jataka?
Yeah, so the Avanajataka is a text, and the theory of this text, it's been around for a very long time, but it's only about 30 or 40 years ago that a young aspiring academic named David Pingree found the surviving manuscripts of this text and then edited them together in a critical edition and translated them. And he tried to argue as part of his PhD thesis that this was originally a Greek text on Hellenistic astrology that was taken over on a trading ship to Western India, where it was translated into Sanskrit and then merged with some of the indigenous traditions of astrology that already existed there. And he argued that this was actually the starting point or the fountainhead of many of the traditions of natal astrology that still survive in India and are practiced to this day.
What do you think about that theory?
I think it's a good theory. I think there's some parts of it that don't make sense. Like some parts of the system are very similar to Hellenistic astrology. So that if you take my book on Hellenistic astrology and how I document that astrology was practiced in the West 2,000 years ago, you'll actually find that it's incredibly similar to Indian astrology and how it's practiced today, especially in terms of some of the Parashara traditions and the early sort of traditions of Indian astrology. But despite those similarities, there's also some really major differences, like in the aspect doctrine with the special aspects. Some of the timing systems, like even though they had Dasha systems in the Hellenistic, the Greek tradition, some of the Dasha systems are already very different in the Indian tradition, and they're already there in the Avanajataka. So clearly there was already some traditions of astrology that were in India up to that point, besides the Avanajata, including the use of the nakshatras, but the introduction of the astrology that the Yavanajataka certainly brought something new that sort of created an interesting fusion or synthesis.
Hmm. Yeah, it's so compelling that the basic you call the fourfold system, right?
Right.
Houses, signs, aspects, and what's the fourth?
Planets.
Planets,
Right.
planets, aspects, houses, and signs. That's basically that's the core of almost any. Is there an astrological tradition or a culture in the world that doesn't use this system?
I mean, there might be some like in Mesoamerica where they focused on other things like the Venus cycle, or in Chinese astrology, some traditions where Western astrology was transmitted there use that fourfold system, but their indigenous astrology is more focused on, something else that's more numerological. But yeah, that's really, that fourfold system is usually what we refer to as horoscopic astrology,
Right.
which is any type of astrology that uses the ascendant and the houses and other things that are derived from that. And that system is something that Western astrology has been predicated on for about 2,000 years, and that Indian astrology has also been predicated on for at least 2,000 years.
Mm. Okay. Yeah, I thought that it was so interesting that people think that most people, like most lay people, think that there's such a
Mhm.
huge difference between Vedic astrology and Western astrology. But I always felt that Vedic astrology is just the old Western astrology, more or
Yeah, I
less.
mean that's essentially true. Well, because it's true that modern Western astrology is very different and looks very different than Vedic astrology. But what happens is just that the Vedic and Indian tradition has been much more continuous over the past 2,000 years, and it hasn't had as many breaks and starts and stops in the tradition as there has been in the West. And so that continuity and the continuation of the tradition has led it to be still very similar to the way that it was 2,000 years ago. Whereas in the West, we've had different empires like rise and fall, and astrology has been transmitted to 4 or 5 or 6 different languages. So it's like this long 2,000 year long game of like telephone, like, where
Hmm.
people sit in a circle and one person like whispers something into the first person's ear and then they pass it to the next person. they've been doing that in the West for 2,000 years. And when you do that, things change and some things are added and other things are lost. And some of those are positive changes, but others can sometimes be negative changes, where when we actually went back over the past 20 years and started looking at the ancient Western texts, we learned that there were a bunch of techniques that simply weren't transmitted, that Western astrologers didn't know that they were missing, and they were really crucial things.
Can I ask you for a couple of examples? Like you said that Western Hellenistic astrology had something like a Dasha system. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, so the Dasha systems, they referred to them in Greek as chronocrator systems, which means Time Lord. So they would refer to the planets when they were activated at different points in the native's life as a Time Lord. And the basic premise is that not all parts of the chart are activated at all times, but instead certain parts lie dormant or asleep with their potentials sort of inactive until the planet is activated as a Time Lord. And then at that point, whatever the natal potential is, or as Indian astrologers say, the natal promise sometimes, is awakened or delivered at that time. And it turned out we've recovered at least half a dozen, if not more, Time Lord systems that existed in the Western tradition. And they're very similar to the Indian Dasha systems, where you have a general period that will indicate a number of years, like a decade or two, and then you can have a sub-period which will break it up for months, and then a third level or a fourth level sub-period. And these systems are divided in different ways. Like some of them are more focused on the signs, and other are more focused on the planets. But functionally, the way that they work is very similar to the Dasha systems in the Indian tradition.
And did you outline that in detail in the book?
Yeah, so I deal with the two most effective Time Lord systems that I found in the text that I worked with are annual perfections, which I deal with, I think, in chapter 17, one of the last chapters, and then finally zodiacal releasing, which is the most effective and sort of impressive timing system that I've found, which I deal with in the final chapter of the book.
Great. Actually, I wanted to ask you this. So obviously, like you're a scholar of astrology, but you give readings and things?
Yeah, I do consultations. I've been, I started doing astrology 17 years ago, I think, studying it first as a modern astrologer. And then about 5 years into my studies, I found Hellenistic astrology and went more traditional, but I use sort of a blend of the two. But I've been doing consultations all along.
Yeah, I think that's valuable. If one is only a practitioner and not a scholar, or only a scholar and not a practitioner, there's a blind spot, I think.
Yeah, there's a bit of an issue because there was a big movement about 10 years ago for astrologers to get into academia in order to gain greater respectability and in order to be able to interact with the academic community. But then what happened is a lot of the astrologers stopped practicing astrology and then just focused on writing papers and doing academic research. And while there's something valuable about that, you also lose something if you completely divorce yourself from the practice. So it's kind of tricky.
Yeah. There was something else. Oh yeah, about these special aspects. Now you say that's unique to Vedic Indian astrology. Special aspects, yeah. You mean that, okay, Saturn has a different pattern than Venus has.
Yeah, because I mean, and it's the three outer planets especially, right? It's like Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Right. And it's like in the Hellenistic tradition, they all essentially have the same aspects. You have the sextile, the square, the trine, and the opposition and the conjunction. And then different planets have the ability to be more harmful or more beneficial in some of those aspects, depending on, like, if it's a benefic making a trine, that's going to be the most positive or affirming type aspect you can have. Whereas if it's a malefic making an opposition, that's going to be the most difficult. So there's variations like that, but you don't have necessarily like special aspects that only apply to certain planets. And that's one of the things that is unique.
I wanted to also ask you about because the chapters that I've read so far are obviously the first couple. So in the first couple of chapters, you talk about pre-Hellenistic stuff. And I know it's not your specialty, but even if it's not your specialty, you're probably more learned about it than 99% of the rest of us anyway. So can I ask you some questions about that?
Sure.
Okay. So what was happening before Hellenistic astrology in the West?
Sure. So as far as most of the academics are concerned, astrology, for the most part, at least Western astrology, originated in Mesopotamia, and the oldest records we have are on little cuneiform tablets that date to about 1500 BCE. So they think they were practicing astrology and that they started collecting celestial omens by about 2000 BCE, but they don't have full records or evidence of it. But starting by 1500 BCE, they start seeing that the astrologers were making observations of celestial movements and what those correlated with on Earth using simple conditional statements that were in the formula of if X, then Y. So if there's an eclipse, then the king will die, or if there is this astronomical phenomenon, then there will be a famine or a plague or something like that. So the first type of astrology was mundane astrology. And I think, as far as I know, over in India, you have kind of like a parallel development, although their astrology is more focused on the nakshatras, and that's the indigenous astrology that's being developed over there, is primarily focused on that 28 or 27, division, focused on specific fixed stars. So in the Mesopotamian tradition, eventually they keep building up larger and larger libraries, and astrology starts playing a more pivotal role in society. And it's still the type of astrology that we would refer to as mundane astrology that applies to groups of people in cities and nations. But then eventually it started getting more and more complex, and it started spurring on the development of more complex astronomical models so that they got better at doing astronomy. So around the 5th century BCE, they started being able to produce ephemerides. And around the same time period, the concept of natal astrology shows up, so that the oldest datable birth charts, so the oldest datable charts of somebody having the idea that you can cast a chart for the day that a person was born, and the alignment of the planets will indicate something about their future. The oldest charts we can find date to 410 BCE on little cuneiform tablets from the Mesopotamian tradition. So as far as we know, at least by that point and by the 5th century BCE, the concept of natal astrology is introduced. And then after that, over the next few centuries, you start seeing other little developments, like them dividing the planets into two groups, which happen to be the same groups that later astrologers would associate with the benefic and malefic planets. So they treated Venus and Jupiter as a group, and Saturn and Mars as a group, and other sort of little developments like that. And then all of a sudden in the 1st century BCE, we just see this explosion of this new system come virtually out of nowhere. And that's what Hellenistic astrology is, because then all of a sudden you get houses and aspects and the sign rulership scheme of, Mercury rules Gemini and the moon rules Cancer, that has no precedent in the earlier tradition. And that just shows up out of nowhere, along with several other techniques so that you end up with Hellenistic astrology. And so one of the debates I talk about in the book is, where did Hellenistic astrology come from and how was it developed?
Okay, so what I heard you saying is initially, the initial form of astrology was something like reading omens, but these omens were omens that are in the sky. Like instead of looking at, a crow just flew across the window, we would say, a star just fell out of the sky.
Yeah, exactly. And apparently, actually, astrology was one of the later forms of divination that was developed. And there was other forms of divination, like watching the flight of birds or looking at entrails and things like that were developed first. And then astrology came along, and it was largely treated the same way because, if you don't have a complex mathematical astronomy that can predict into the future where the planets will be in the future or where they've been in the past, then astronomical events oftentimes look much more random and much more chance-like, which is typically what you're using in most other forms of divination, is just things that happen by chance or arrangements that happen by chance, and trying to look at that as having some sort of symbolic meaning.
Right.
So they would look at things like a halo around the moon or other sort of visible phenomenon like that.
Right. Okay, and then I would say also that if your mathematical system is not very well developed, you can't really, even if you have a theory of equal divisions or various divisions of the sky, you can't really act on that theory because you can't really measure these theoretical divisions, right?
Yeah, I mean, they didn't really have the zodiac, for a long time. They had probably certain fixed stars and then eventually developed certain constellations, but it's not until pretty late in the game that we start getting the zodiac as an idealized division of the ecliptic into 12.
Late in the game means?
They think that the 5th century BCE is usually when it's dated to, so right about the same time that natal astrology develops, and only 2 or 3 or 4 centuries before Hellenistic astrology shows up. So a lot of this stuff happens really quickly over a few century time period.
But yet people had calendars, right?
Right.
Did they not?
Yeah.
Long time ago, like 2000 BCE.
Right.
And those calendars were like our calendar today or different?
I mean, there's different calendars depending on what culture you're talking about. I mean, the Egyptians had one calendar, like an idealized 360-day calendar. You have the Mesopotamians and various cultures within that having different calendars. So
So
yeah.
the Egyptian one sounds like ours.
Yeah, I mean, well, it was 360 days, sort of, so more of an idealized calendar, but then they used a sort of fudge factor for the additional 5 days.
Right. But they have like 12 sections of, they're dividing 360 by 12?
Not necessarily. I mean, for the Egyptians, they developed their own independent form of astrology that was focused on the decans, which is 36 divisions or fixed stars, which later came to be 10-degree divisions. But they were more focused on looking at certain planets that were, or certain fixed stars that were rising or culminating overhead. So they were focused much more on the diurnal rotation, which is what later came to be associated with the houses, like the ascendant and the midheavens. So one of the theories is that it's from the Egyptian tradition that we get the concept of the houses, and it's from the Mesopotamian tradition that we get the concept of the zodiac. So each culture was focused on a different frame of reference, one on the diurnal rotation and the other on the ecliptic. And then it gets merged together in the 1st and 2nd century BCE to create this new system. And that's why it sort of shows up out of nowhere, seemingly.
Okay. Can you explain what diurnal rotation is?
Yeah, it's just the daily rotation where the sun rises in the morning and it culminates overhead in the middle of the day, and then it sets in the evening, and then it goes under the earth and anti-culminates before rising again in the next morning.
Great. So it's the basis of the house system, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just the fact that not just the sun does that, but all of the planets rise and culminate and set. Yeah. And so when you start focusing on that as a daily sort of rotation, you're looking at a specific frame of reference that's different from the movement on the ecliptic.
Okay. How about Mesopotamian calendar? How is that divided up?
I mean, that's the one where you start getting into, the zodiac and the seasons and different things like that, and things like the solar lunar calendar, like you've talked about in some of your videos in the past.
Okay. Now, one thing that was really interesting in your first chapter that I really connected with, because it's my own feeling, it was my own feeling from the very beginning, is you said that the early Roman readers didn't really feel like these events, these things in the sky were causing events on Earth, but that they were just hints or indicators about things that were going to happen. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this seems to be pretty common throughout ancient astrology, and especially in the Mesopotamian tradition, the idea that the planets were representing a sort of heavenly script or sort of language that was conveying messages and information to humankind about the will or the intention of the gods or things about the future. But it was not necessarily that the planets were causing, or they didn't have any conceptualization of the planets emitting some sort of force, but instead it was just seen as a sort of language or a sort of omen that was conveying some information symbolically.
So I think that's so important, because then it's not a force that's being emitted and affecting your life fatalistically, but it's just some sort of hint about what's going on as a result of the system that you're participating in. Is that right?
Yeah, that has a huge ramifications for the way that astrology is conceptualized and practiced, as well as what you do with it, or what you would actually do with that information. That was an incredibly important piece. And eventually in the Hellenistic tradition, that changed because there started to be a debate where they started to develop some ideas of celestial causation, because they would look at like the fact that the moon affects the tides. And they would say, since the moon affects the tides, therefore the sun and some of the other planets must also have some sort of influence or effect on the earth or the weather or on human beings as well. And so there started to be this debate in the Western tradition at that point, where some astrologers thought the planets caused things to happen, and other astrologers continued the older tradition of thinking that the planets just signified or indicated what would happen in the future. And it became kind of a long-standing debate in the Western tradition.
So is that like in Ptolemy's books, you get some of those kind of feelings? Like he talks about the planets are going to have an effect on things?
Yeah, exactly. Ptolemy was a polymath and like a scientist. It was like if Neil deGrasse Tyson, or more like, Carl Sagan or somebody, wanted to write a book, not just on astrology, but if he wanted to write a book on all of the major fields of science in his day, and to create like a grand unified theory that brought all of them together by making them all conceptually make sense within the same context. That's basically what Ptolemy tried to do. And for astrology, one of the things that he wanted to do is he didn't think the omen-based model made sense, and he wanted to make astrology sort of look appealing or look valid within the scientific context of his day. And so he tried to reconceptualize it as an astrology of causes, and to show how all of the different planets and all the things they mean in astrology could all be rationalized by the planets causing those things to happen through atmospheric or through emitting different levels of heat or moisture or things like that. And that was very different than what the other astrologers, we have text from other astrologers who are contemporary with Ptolemy, including one guy named Vettius Valens, who lived in Egypt just a few decades after Ptolemy. He must have been living in the same city at the same time. And his astrology is just completely different than what Ptolemy was doing. But because Ptolemy published some extremely important and influential astronomical works, this made subsequent astrologers take his astrology much more seriously than it otherwise would have been. And so his text survived and was continually transmitted and translated over the past 2,000 years, whereas other texts by guys like Valens were not necessarily.
So the modern concept of planets exerting influence upon our life can be traced to Hellenistic? What some Hellenistic, like Ptolemaic Hellenistic view?
Yeah, basically, for the most part. I mean, there may have been some other, cultures that had similar ideas. I don't know about the Egyptian tradition, but for the most part, we owe that to Ptolemy. And one of the things about that, it's like a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, some academics argue that Ptolemy reformulating astrology like that actually allowed astrology to survive in the West during the Middle Ages, because when the Christian church developed and became stronger, it saw astrology as sort of threatening. So they sort of tried to stamp astrology out during the Middle Ages, but usually the way that defenders of astrology would try to defend it and sort of get away with practicing it still would be to say that it's part of the natural world and we're just studying, basically physics, the same way that you would study the weather or the seasons or things like that. And they would appeal to Ptolemy and Ptolemy's justifications of astrology on a naturalistic level. And it kind of worked. And astrology and the church were kind of had this uneasy relationship for many centuries, but it at least allowed it to survive.
Now you mentioned Valens. How different and what are some of the points of difference between Valens and Ptolemy?
Sure. So, I mean, Ptolemy, one of the things about Ptolemy is Ptolemy may not have been a practicing astrologer. So he may have been somebody who was deeply engaged in many different fields of scientific research, but a lot of his work may have been theoretical, whereas so Ptolemy never once introduces an example chart, for example. But if you look at Vettius Valens, it's clear that he was a practicing astrologer who saw clients, and he includes over 100 example charts in his work. And it's really wild to see some of his example charts because since he outlines the planetary positions of each chart, you can go back and date them, and you can actually reconstruct the chronology of his sort of like career as an astrologer by some of the clients that he was seeing and by the different time periods of when these people were born versus what events he said happened in their life at different points. So we've actually been able to reconstruct a really reliable chronology of Valens's life through that. And so that's one of the major differences, is that Valens will show you how the techniques work and he'll show you how they work in practice, but he'll also say, sometimes he'll say, the ancients say to do this, or he'll cite some source who says this, but then he'll say, but in my opinion, it works better if you do this. So he was involved in a kind of critical analysis of the tradition, but he would still respectfully oftentimes give the opinion of his predecessors, whereas Ptolemy typically won't do that. He'll just present the approach that he thinks is best, and oftentimes he'll leave certain things out that he doesn't agree with or that he doesn't like, conceptually or practically.
Is there some key difference in the astrological theory of the two?
Yeah, I mean, let's see, in terms of techniques, like Valens preserves at least 5 or 6 different Time Lord systems, including zodiacal releasing, whereas Ptolemy, I think, only has maybe 1 or 2 timing systems, but those timing systems are things like primary directions and things like that. So it's some of the techniques that survived into modern day in the Western tradition, whereas Valens is very much focused basically on the Dasha systems and finding the best Dasha system he can and comparing some of them and talking about the different sources. And that's really the majority of his work is outlining what systems existed in his day and showing you the ones that seem to work the best to him.
Now, if somebody wanted to research more about his astrology, how do you say his first name?
It's Vettius Valens.
That's kind of cool. Vettius sounds very Vedic.
Well, he's literally like a Roman, Roman citizen living in the 2nd century in Alexandria in Egypt, which was a Greek city at the time. It was founded by Alexander the Great, and he had a school for astrology, and he had students, and he talks about his students and dedicates one of the books to him to his student at one point. And you actually get a sense that this was a real guy who was living 2,000 years ago, and he was not some guru or some like far out sort of like spiritual sort of guy. It was just like some regular guy who was, relatively smart and, average or above average astrologer. But reading his text, you actually get a sense of what life was like in the 2nd century, 2,000 years ago, and that it was not actually as different as you might assume that it was today, that life, the main points of life at least, or the fundamentals were still very much the same, to him as it is to us.
So he really illustrates how multicultural it was at that time too, right? Vettius is Roman and he's in Egypt as speaking Greek.
Yeah, and he's drawing on text from like Egyptians and Mesopotamians and Greeks and Persians, and there's just this huge like cultural intermingling that's going on, but it's drawing on all of these great astrological traditions in order to create a new synthesis.
Since you mentioned Persia, it sparked another question. In India, there are books called like Tajik Nilamani, and they refer to Persians as Tajiks, Tajikistan. So what's Persian astrology? Is it a separate development, or is it just a culture that adopted Hellenistic astrology and took it?
No, I mean, what happened was, well, it's kind of tricky, but so I talk about this in chapter 5, which is the transmission of Hellenistic astrology to other cultures. And there were 3 major transmissions. One of them was to India through the Avanajataka and perhaps other texts. One of them was to Persia, where starting in about the 2nd or 3rd century, there were some texts that were translated from Greek into Persian, the Middle Persian language, which was Sasanian. And one of those texts was actually Valens. They translated parts of Valens into Persian. They also translated the text of Dorotheus into Persian. And then there was a sort of astrological tradition that developed surrounding these translations of Hellenistic texts into Persian for a few centuries. And then eventually in the 7th and 8th century, you have the advent of the Islamic Empire, and the Roman Empire declines almost completely. And what happens is you get a transmission of some Greek texts, which are translated into Arabic in the 8th and 9th centuries. And then at the same time, they translate some of the older Persian texts, like Dorotheus and Valens, that had been translated into Persian. They then translate those into Arabic, and it creates this new tradition and this new synthesis. So that creates what is essentially, when we refer to as medieval astrology or medieval Western astrology, it's the type of astrology that was that synthesis in the 8th and 9th centuries. And then that tradition, as far as I understand, gets fed back through the Persians into India. And Tajika astrology is essentially the equivalent of medieval Western astrology, basically.
So what are the time periods? You got medieval is like Persian later on. Before that, what would we call it?
It's basically like Hellenistic, then medieval. Hellenistic and then medieval is basically roughly speaking, the 2 major ones. So
can we say ancient, Hellenistic, medieval, and then modern?
Yeah, or like I say Mesopotamian, usually to refer to the 2,000-year tradition of astrology and the different cultures in Mesopotamia from about 2000 BCE until about the 1st century BCE. Then you have Hellenistic that starts in the 1st century BCE through the 7th century CE. And then you have medieval that's basically from the 8th century through the 12th or 13th century.
This is great. Okay, so I want to have more interviews with you if possible. As I read more of your book, I'll come up with more questions probably.
Of course, yeah,
and
anytime.
I'd really like to explore the similarities and differences between this Hellenistic system and the Vedic system.
Yeah, I think once you get especially to the basic techniques, but also some of the timing systems, the Time Lord systems, that you're going to see a lot of similarities. And that's one of the things I'm so excited about, is that, we're recovering these Dasha systems from the Western tradition from 2,000 years ago, but they haven't been practiced in 2,000 years. And there's only so much insight that the texts actually give you about how to use them. So there's actually a lot that Western astrologers, as we're reviving some of these Dasha systems in the Western tradition, can learn from Indian astrologers, because they've been using, similar techniques all along.
Right.
And so just by studying Indian astrology, I found some really useful points that have been really useful in helping me to elucidate how to use these techniques for the past decade.
Well, amongst Indian astrologers, the rationale or logic of the Dasha systems is a great mystery. Like nobody can figure out why in a particular system there'll be a certain order of planets, or why there's a particular length or anything. But it would be great if understanding some of these Hellenistic or older Dasha, Western Dasha systems might cast some light on that.
Yeah, and I think that's possible because there's a lot of things in Hellenistic astrology. The thing that drew me to it is it seemed to have the answers to a lot of techniques that astrologers take for granted in the Western tradition and just use as part of the tradition. In Hellenistic astrology, you can actually see the rationale for how they came up with those techniques. So, why the exaltations mean what they mean, or where the domicile assignments come from, or different things like that, that there's an actual theoretical rationale underlying everything that you can actually figure out. And there's a little bit of that in the Dasha systems as well, where some of the planetary periods come from Hellenistic astrology and are connected with specific astronomical cycles.
Well, one more question.
Sure.
One of the big, things that the typical champion of Vedic astrology will say is, well, we have Dasha systems and those guys don't. That's why we're better. The other one is, well, we have Aṁśas. We have Varga charts and Aṁśas. Are Varga charts, are Aṁśas of zodiac signs part of Hellenistic tradition also? Or is that uniquely Indian?
There's several subdivisional charts in the Hellenistic tradition. The biggest one, of course, was the 12th parts, the 12th division, where you divide up each of the signs into 12 sub-signs. And that evidently actually comes from the Mesopotamian tradition, because they've found cuneiform tablets where they also have that division of the signs into 12 parts. So apparently that's something that goes back into that much older tradition that was carried forward. But there's also other subdivisions in the Hellenistic tradition. There's the division of the signs into 5, which I think are called trimshamshas in the Yavana Jataka. So that exists. Those are the terms or the bounds in the Hellenistic tradition, and there's a few different approaches to that, but they were very important and very pivotal subdivisions in the Hellenistic tradition. There's also a division into 3, which is just the decans or the Dorkanas in the Indian tradition. But those also actually is really interesting, had a subdivision in certain charts into either 7 or 9, which is actually really interesting, because then that connects it with the Navamshas, which, at least in the Hellenistic tradition, they may have originally treated as subdivisions of the decans into 3 to end up with 9. Interesting.
And also, I always thought it was highly suspicious that they have a division of a sign into halves, and they call it a hora. Mm-hmm. And that's a Greek word. And then they have the division into 3 is called a drekan, which is a decan.
Right.
So,
yeah. Exactly.
And everything else is called nani, this Aṁśa, that Aṁśa, right? But these two ones are called hora and drekan. So it seems pretty suspicious to say that this is an Indian invention. Even from the start. Even if I didn't know anything. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. And that's really the biggest piece of evidence that really shows that there was a transmission of Hellenistic astrology to India at some point, and that it did seriously inform the way that astrology is still practiced there today. And that early synthesis of natal astrology and electional and horary is the fact that you do have those loan words that are like Greek words that mean something and have semantic connections in Greek. And then they're transmitted into Sanskrit, and oftentimes, instead of being translated, they were transliterated, so that it's just the same Greek word, but it's been, turned into Sanskrit.
What are some examples of those?
So another one that I like is the void of course one, kemadruma. In the Hellenistic tradition, it's kenodromia, and kenos means running, and dromos means void, or emptiness. So it means running in the emptiness is the original Greek word, which then later in the Western tradition gets called void of course. And you have the same or a similar concept in the Indian tradition, just called, Kemadruma, I think is what it's called, right?
I would question you on that one, because that one has meaning. That one has an etymological meaning in Sanskrit as well. But like,
what's the meaning?
Well, Druma is a tree, and there's several yogas that are named for trees. Like there's a Kalpadruma, and then the Kemadruma. And Kema means becoming very, very skinny, coming down to the meat. If you go to an Indian restaurant, you could still hopefully you wouldn't, but you would order a Kema curry. You get like a beef curry. It's disgusting, but
sure.
So they have a Kemadruma. It's just the meat. It's like just the flesh. It's like a withering tree is the way I think of it. But I was thinking maybe Kendra.
Yeah, Kendra. The Greek term was kentron. And it has two meanings. It's actually one of the more difficult terms to translate because we don't have a good English term that covers both meanings. But one part of it means something sharp, like a spike that pokes or goads something into action. So it had the conceptualization of poking or goading the planets into action when they're in the angular houses, the kentrons. The other meaning is that it's a pivot, or it's something around which something else turns. So it gets connected with the declining houses and the succedent houses because it becomes like a pivot around which the other houses and the other planets turn.
Mm-hmm. How about Kona?
Kona, what's the concept again? I forget what.
They have I think Kona in Greek is like the angle itself, right? Like a tree cone.
Oh, right, yeah. So There's a term.
That survives in Sanskrit too.
I'm forgetting the term. I mean, there's another one where they actually did translate it in the Avnajataka, where it looks like they translated the term kentron and found an actual Sanskrit word for it, and they translated it as spike, which is actually a good translation of kentron. I forget what the Sanskrit term was that they actually used, but there were some instances where they actually translated or they found the equivalent Sanskrit term. Yeah, but there's others like apoklima is literally just the Greek word for decline or something that falls away from something else, because the cadent houses fall away from the angles, or the planets on them are falling away from the height of the angles. Does apoklima have any Sanskrit?
No, it's completely Greek. Completely Greek. Yeah.
And epinephrine is another one. I think what's the Sanskrit term?
What is that? I've never heard it before. Second square?
Epinephra. It's the succedent house.
Yes, succedent is what I've heard.
What's the Sanskrit word for?
I'm not sure.
Like panaphora or something like that.
Something like that. Doesn't sound very Sanskrit.
Right. So it's epinephra in Greek, which means post-ascension, or that which follows after something, because the succedent houses are the ones that succeed or rise up after the angles.
I see. Epinephrine. Yeah. Isn't there a medicine nowadays called epinephrine?
Yeah, it's probably connected. I'll have to look into that.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of mysteries that we could solve too, like things that just don't make sense in Vedic astrology that because we lost the context of what made a person think of calling it this. Like a planet in Vedic astrology has a mul tree cone, a special place. It's not just its own sign, but it's its own sign that's special. It's the male one. Why is it called a mul tree? Why is that word assigned to it?
Right. Yeah. There's a few things like that, or some of the subdivisional charts. But there's also some places where reading the Avnajataka, it's got a little bit more information, so that there's been stuff that we've lost in the Western tradition, where I'm sure the Indian tradition would actually inform what Western astrologers should be doing, or what their tradition used to be. One of the areas that I'm interested in is there's just huge debate about the house division issue in the Western tradition. And that's one of the areas where there's just immediately so many similarities with the Indian tradition and Hellenistic astrology, because the Hellenistic astrologers all use whole sign houses, where whatever sign the ascendant is located in, that entire sign becomes the first house. The sign after that becomes the second house, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of similarity there, but then there's some additional details about what you do with those other forms of house division and how they're used as a sort of secondary overlay on top of that. That seems like we have glances or just pieces of it, fragments of it in the Western tradition, where we can sort of see them trying to do something like that, but it seems like that might be a little bit more worked out in some of the Indian traditions.
Yeah, I'm sure there can be a lot of back and forth,
Right.
friendly exchange.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's always been that, and it doesn't have to be like a cultural rivalry thing. It's like, it doesn't have to be something where it's something that you want to, brush under the rug or not admit or something like that, because it's something where having that information could be helpful to practitioners of both traditions, and it could lead to a greater understanding of this system that we share in common, rather than somebody trying to, take credit for it or something like that.
Okay. All right. So let me just show you your book one more time. It's Hellenistic Astrology by Kris Brennan. It's a fantastic book.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to hear that you're enjoying it.
Yeah, I really am. And it's well written too. You're a good writer. It's so painful sometimes when somebody has really good information but no writing skills. But you have very good information and very good writing skills.
Yeah, I'm happy that I took as long as I did to write it in order to improve my writing skills along the way. And then I took last year off from doing consultations in order to just focus on rewriting the book, and hired an editor to work with me, a guy named Aaron Cheek, who specializes in ancient Greco-Roman alchemy. And that turned out to be a really worthwhile sort of partnership.
So this is for sale to the general public right now?
Yeah, the book came out in February. It actually came out on February 10th on the last lunar eclipse. So it's kind of funny that we just had the most recent one a couple of days ago. And yeah, you can. I've just switched recently where I'm just having people order it through Amazon and other online retailers like that, since that's usually the easiest thing. But if anybody has trouble ordering it in their location, they can send me an email, and I can always ship out a copy from here in Denver.
Okay, great. All right, thank you so much, Kris. This is going to be a great interview. I hope everybody loves it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me.
Okay, please come back again soon.
Definitely.
Thank you.